Good afternoon. Welcome to today's webinar. Thank you for joining us online today. My name is Kirsten Matthews. I am the Fellow in Science and Technology Policy at Rice University's Baker Institute for Public Policy. Today's lecture is titled COVID-19, Climate Change, Reaching Across the Aisle, and this is a collaboration between the Science and Technology Policy Program and the student group Rice Science Policy Network. Funding for today's event was provided through the Science and Technology Policy Civic Scientist series, generously provided by a gift by Winifred and Benjamin Chain, as well as sponsorship from the Rice Weiss School of Natural Sciences and the Brown School of Engineering. In addition, we are funded for outreach through grants by the Kavli Foundation and the National Science Foundation. Before we start, I'd like to thank all the Baker Institute staff, our event staff, who have helped put this together, including Daniel Morelli from our Science and Technology Policy Program, as well as members of the Rice Science Policy Network who helped bring our speaker here today. Introducing and moderating our Q&A this afternoon will be a member of the Rice Science Policy Network, who is also a Baker Institute Developing Civic Scientist Leader intern and a Rice graduate student in chemistry, Jordan Menz. Jordan and his colleagues developed the Rice Science Policy Network this summer to bring together graduate and undergraduate students at Rice interested in public policy and engagement. As an intern in the Developing Civic Scientist Leaders Program, he also helped raise awareness with policymakers about the importance of funding basic research. He also worked this year and published several opinion articles in the Baker Institute blog, discussing environmental policy changes in the Trump administration, as well as encouraging scientists to remember to enjoy the wonder of science, despite the chaos of this past year. So I'm going to move now to Jordan and let him introduce our speaker today.
Thank you so much, Dr. Matthews. Now I'd like to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Katharine Hayhoe. Dr. Hayhoe is a climate scientist and the political science endowed professor in public policy and public law in the Department of Political Science at Texas Tech University. She co-directs the Climate Center at Texas Tech, and her research focuses on establishing a scientific basis for assessing the regional to local scale impacts of climate change on human systems and the natural environment. She's also the founder and CEO of Atmos Research, which works to bridge the gap between scientists and stakeholders to provide relevant, state-of-the-art information on how climate change will affect our lives to a broad range of nonprofit, industry, and government clients. Dr. Hayhoe is a prolific speaker, often giving talks on climate science, impacts, communication, and faith, including a TED Talk that has almost 4 million views. We're thrilled to have Dr. Hayhoe here today to present on climate change, science skepticism, and how to discuss the science of climate change in a nonpartisan fashion. Climate change is particularly a topic of great interest for Houston, a city that sees regular flooding and powerful hurricanes, while also serving as a global hub for oil and gas. In this era of polarization and amid a dangerous pandemic, we look forward to hearing strategies for how to come together to solve problems facing our country and our world. We'll begin with a 25-minute presentation by Dr. Hayhoe. Afterwards, we'll open up the conversation with some questions prepared in advance, as well as from the audience. Please feel free to submit questions in the Q&A box during the remarks or afterwards during the Q&A session. Please try and keep your questions short, just a couple lines, and remember that you can upvote questions. Without further ado, Dr. Katharine Hayhoe.
Thank you so much. It is great to be with you here today. So I study what climate change means to us in the places where we live. And I've talked extensively elsewhere, specifically about how climate change will be affecting Texas and what is already happening here in the state and in Houston. But today I'm going to be talking about this from a slightly different perspective. We're now in 2021. We have lived through almost a year of the COVID pandemic, and I'm going to talk specifically about what we learn from COVID that we can apply to climate, what they have in common, what synergies there are and interactions there are between them, and where we might go in the future, specifically looking at the interaction and relationship between climate, science, and policy. So let me share my screen. Here we go, and we'll get started. Remember, as you go along, you can put your questions at any time in the Q&A, and even if you don't have questions, you can check out the Q&A and you can upvote questions as we go along, because we have a lot of people on this webinar. We probably won't be able to take all the questions. So if you see a question that you think is particularly interesting, please upvote it to make sure that we get to it at the end. climate change, COVID, and policymaking. What do we know? What have we seen? Well, first of all, I want to start with a point that might seem obvious, but it's a very important one. We have known about the risks of both pandemics and viruses and the risks of climate change for a very long time. As far as we go back in the history of written human civilization on this planet, we have stories, some stories from religious texts, some stories from written histories, some stories that we're very familiar with or less familiar with, some stories that we've even lived through ourselves, like SARS, bird flu, swine flu, Ebola. We know that plagues, pandemics, and viruses are part of human history. And in fact, even if we weren't historians, or even if we weren't history buffs, we would still have read about them in fictional books, nonfiction books, movies, and more. The impact of viruses, pandemics, and plagues on our health is central to understanding our human existence on this planet. They are no surprise. The specific risk they pose from jumping from animal to human populations, a process called zoonosis, which is how we got COVID-19, this specific risk has also been known to medical professionals for a very long time. This is just one example, an article that was written in 1988 by the late Josh Lederberg. He said in this article, "We have too many illusions that we can govern the microbes that remain our competitors for dominion of the planet. The opening of wild lands to human occupation has exposed people to unaccustomed viruses and zoonosis," which again is the process by which viruses jump from animal to human populations. What about climate change? You might be surprised to learn that it has been 55 years. Now, I know this headline says 50, but this headline is from 5 years ago. It has been 55 years since scientists warned a US president about the dangers posed by global warming. We scientists have known that digging up and burning coal at that time, and then later oil and natural gas, are producing heat-trapping gases that are wrapping an extra blanket around the planet, causing it to warm, since the 1800s. But it wasn't until about 55 or 60 years ago that scientists were confident enough that the risks posed by this action were large enough, were economically damaging enough, threatened a large enough portion of our civilization as we know it, that they felt like the president needed to know. And it wasn't just the president who knew. It turns out when we go back in history, scientists working for some of the biggest oil and gas companies in the world knew decades ago and informed the leadership of the companies decades ago exactly what the impact of their business was on the planet and the future of human civilization as we know it. Car companies who create the vehicles that burn the fossil fuels, much of what we use, they also understood the relationship between fossil fuel combustion, heat-trapping gas emissions, climate change, and risks. And here's the interesting thing. Despite personal histories that we might have with the risks posed by pandemics and by climate change, even still, we can disregard those risks. So I just want to give you a very personal example. I lost both of my great-grandparents in the Spanish flu pandemic. My great-grandmother Gertrude died in 1919, age 26. Her husband, Walter, followed her less than a year later, leaving my grandfather an orphan at age 4. And in fact, the reason why my last name is Scott Hayhoe, as opposed to just Scott, is because my grandfather was adopted by his aunt, who then married a Hayhoe, and so he added Hayhoe to his name. So my name is actually the result of the Spanish flu pandemic. So you might say, well, of course you took COVID seriously, but I live in 2021, not 1919. And so in March, when the very early days of March, the very first days in March, when we were starting to hear that there might be a case in California and there might be another case, maybe I think in Washington state, we heard about maybe 3 or 4 cases of COVID in the United States, beginning in March. I was packing up to go on a speaking trip in Ireland. I give the vast majority of my talks online already to reduce my carbon footprint. But when I do travel in person, what I do is I collect invitations, and I only travel when I have a critical mass such that I'm going to one place, in the case of Ireland, to do 18 talks and events in 11 days, so that the carbon footprint of each individual event is very small. So I had planned this trip to Ireland for over a year and a half, because it takes a long time to coordinate all the different events at different universities and organizations. And I was packing my bag, and my husband said, well, I know somebody who knows the person in California who got it. Are you sure that you should be really considering this trip? And I said, oh, yes, I'm from Canada. We had the bird flu there. We had SARS there. Business continued as usual. So off I went to Ireland. And of course, everybody knows what happened next. Travel bans, borders closing, and I managed to make it through half of the events before I had to come home immediately, or I might, who knows, still be gone. So why is it that even though we know the risks and we might have even experienced the risks, we neglect them? It's because of a feature of our human psychology, a self-defense mechanism known as psychological distance. Psychological distance is the idea that to just be able to cope with and process all of the issues that constantly overwhelm us in this modern world, we are always making value judgments about what is urgent and what isn't. And often we decide a lot of things are not urgent if they seem psychologically distant. And they can seem psychologically distant in one of at least four ways. Here are the four ways that are very relevant for COVID and for climate change. The first way that something can seem irrelevant is distant in time. It will affect me much later. And this explains why we don't save enough for retirement, or why we don't eat or exercise as much as we should, because we see those impacts as distant in time. We can see something as distant in space. So, there's a virus over in Asia, but it's not here. Or climate change is affecting polar bears in the Arctic, but not us where we live in Texas. Of course, it is affecting us in Texas. Climate change is making our hurricanes bigger, stronger, and slower. It's increasing our heavy rainfall events. It's estimated that 40% of the rain that fell during Hurricane Harvey was the direct result of that hurricane occurring in a warmer world. We're seeing our droughts are getting stronger and longer. Our heat waves are getting more intense. Of course, we're seeing things happening, but we still tend to think of issues as being distant in space. We see issues, now we're getting a little more nuanced. We see them as abstract rather than concrete. So climate change, global temperature, we can't really even envision global temperature. It's measured by thousands of thermometers around the world over timescales of decades. Whereas if somebody comes in with a snowball and they say, look, there's a snowball, it snowed in Texas, where's global warming? It's very easy for us to look at the snowball, to say it's cold outside, and say, you're right, it is cold outside. Where is global warming? So often these problems are abstract rather than concrete. And here's the fourth way that we distance from them. We distance from them in terms of thinking of them as irrelevant to us. So, COVID might be relevant to people who are already have respiratory disease, so they're more vulnerable, but not us. Climate change might be relevant to people who already consider themselves to be an environmentalist or a liberal or whoever it is we think cares about climate change, but not us. And of course, in reality, to care about climate change, we just have to be a human living on this planet. And to care about COVID, that's all we have to be too, right? But these are the mechanisms that we employ to push these issues away from us. So even though the risks are clearly communicated to us for years and even decades, because of psychological distance, we have, at this moment, as of last year, we have 72% of people in the United States saying that, yes, climate is changing. What you're looking at here is really interesting. It's a series of maps from the Yale program on climate communication. If you want to, actually, you know what, Daniel, if you don't mind just Googling Yale program on climate communication, climate opinion maps 2020, just put that link in the chat for people so they can click on it if they want, because they have results for about 30 different questions by county and by congressional district. So you could hover your mouse over and click on Harris County or on the congressional district that Houston is in, and you'll see the results specifically for Houston. But you can see Houston's a little darker orange than the rest of Texas, but there's some even darker red ones around San Antonio and around Austin. So 72% of people, the majority, say climate is changing, and 71%, almost the same number, say that it will affect plants and animals, okay? So remember, psychological distance, plants and animals. That means it's not relevant to us, it's relevant to plants and animals. This looks like the same map, but it's a different one. The same number of people, 71%, believe that it will harm future generations. What's that? Psychological distance in time. So we have, yes, it will harm plants and animals. Yes, it will harm future generations. Then they said, do you think it will harm people in developing countries? Okay, so now we're at humans who live today, but not here, over there. And so we're still at 65% of people say, yes, it will harm people in developing countries. And of course, that's true. Then they asked, do you think global warming will harm people in the United States? What do we see happening? The number is going down. We're at 61%. Remember, we started at 72. So the closer we get to you, the more the numbers start to go down. And this is not the last question they asked. They asked one more. Do you think global warming will harm you? Look at this. Across almost the whole country, all of a sudden the numbers plummet from the majority of people saying yes to the majority of people saying no. What are the exceptions? The only exceptions, and these are very light yellow exceptions, so just barely over 50%. The only exceptions are large cities like Miami and Houston and LA, large cities that are very vulnerable because they are on the coastline. They are already seeing sea level rising. They're already seeing stronger hurricanes. And this is really interesting. They have large populations of people who represent the most concerned demographic in the entire United States. The group of people in the whole US who are most worried about climate change. Do you have a guess who that might be? Hispanic Catholics. That's the most concerned people group. And you might say, oh, well, of course, because the Pope wrote that big encyclical 5 or 6 years ago on climate change. So it makes sense that Catholics would be concerned. But actually, do you know who the least concerned people group is in the whole United States? The number one least concerned are white Catholics, followed immediately by white evangelicals. So it shows us it's not where we do or don't go to church on a Sunday that's affecting our level of concern. The level of concern falls out typically, number one, along political lines. The further we are to the right-hand side of the political spectrum, the more likely we are to reject 200 years of science. It falls out to a slightly lesser extent along age lines. The younger we are, the more worried we are, even if we're conservative. So young conservatives are much more concerned about climate change than older conservatives. And here's a really interesting thing. It also falls out a little bit along racial lines. Black populations and Hispanic populations tend to be more concerned than white. And it even falls out along gender lines. Women tend to be more concerned. In fact, across the whole US, about 58% of people are either worried, alarmed, or concerned about climate change. But when you survey mothers, women who have children, 83% of us are worried. So these maps show our geographic diversity, but they don't really start to dig in as much into what makes us diverse in the place where we live. And that's a very interesting question. And it relates directly to psychological distance, what we see as posing risks immediately to us. So let's relate this back to COVID. This is a poll showing February to March, people's level of concern over COVID. And if you remember, right around March 15, actually, I think I remember it was pretty much March 14 or 15, that was when the travel ban went into effect. So that was when the hammer really came down, the quarantines, the lockdowns in the United States started right at the end of this figure. So back when I was packing my bag to go off to Ireland and doing my first few talks there, that was at that point, our level of concern in the United States was rising from about 45% to 60%. So it went up about 15% in a single week. Here's the interesting thing. Where are we on climate change? We are as concerned about climate change right now as we were about COVID in the first week in March. And here's the thing. Our concern about COVID went rapidly up because we realized that many more people had it than we imagined, and in fact, it was all over. Will our concern about climate change increase to the point where we take it seriously enough to really do something significant to slow its impacts? I hope it will. But in terms of where we are in public opinion on climate change, we're in the equivalent of the first week in March. Now, where are we in terms of the impacts? I would put our impacts from climate change in April. So you know that already in March, COVID was spreading all through the US. Many more people had it than they imagined. By April, we were starting to see that cases wherever we lived were popping up. There was hardly anywhere that was immune at that point. And of course, by now, everybody has people. Probably you do too. I have people in my family, I have colleagues, students, people I work with, people I know from church. We all have known people who've been affected. So where are we with climate change? We're really in April or almost May, where we can see this in the place where we live. It is already here, it is already now, it's not distant in time, it's not distant in space, and it's not distant in relevance. It's affecting people, places, and communities that we know and that we're familiar with. So there's a little bit of a mismatch in terms of the impacts of climate change. They're further down the road than our level of concern. We know that that's not a good thing because we know that both COVID and climate change affect us in some of the same ways. In fact, one of the biggest ways that they both affect us is through our impacts on our health. Now, you might say, well, of course, COVID is a public health crisis, but is climate change a public health crisis? It is too. So the Johns Hopkins map, as of last week, this is what the map looked like of COVID cases. And of course, the size of the dot indicates the number of cases. And for the US, it's broken out not just by state, but by county. We know that obviously COVID is a huge public health crisis. We have been pushing, I think we're almost at 100 million global cases. Again, this is about a week old. We are over 2 million global deaths from COVID already. And here's the really interesting thing is that there are both indirect and direct links between fossil fuels, air pollution, climate change, and COVID. Let me start with the pollution. We know around the world that 1 in 6 premature deaths are the direct result of the pollution of air, water, or soil. The majority of those deaths occur in low and middle income countries. We know that air pollution causes almost 9 million premature deaths a year. 200,000 of those are in the United States. 200,000 premature deaths due to air pollution every year. How is this not a headline? We know, furthermore, from extremely detailed analyses like this one that I cite here, I'm sorry if your eyes are kind of crossing with all those different colors. Really, frankly, what I want you to take away from here is the complexity of the problem and the fact that we can still track it. So what they've done here is they've actually tracked specific sectors: transportation, food and agriculture, electricity, industry. They've tracked specific activities: rearing livestock, residential heating and cooling, using cars. They've tracked the process, what type of fossil fuel you're burning, and they've tracked it directly to the specific pollutant, and they've tracked that specific pollutant directly to human impacts on what they call morbidity, which is illness, and mortality, which is death. So we have absolutely connected the dots on this. There is no mystery. How else is fossil fuel use affecting our health? Well, it's affecting our health because burning fossil fuels is the #1 reason why climate is changing. Every time we burn coal, gas, or oil, it produces a heat-trapping gas called carbon dioxide that is building up in the atmosphere, that is essentially wrapping an extra blanket around our planet that it does not need. And just like you would, if somebody snuck into your room when you were asleep and put an extra blanket over you, you'd wake up sweating. saying, I didn't need this blanket. In the same way, our planet is running a fever. And as it does so, we see things changing. We see that extreme heat is becoming more frequent and more intense, and that is increasing the risk of heat-related illnesses and death. We also know that we produce a lot of pollutants from our cars, and those pollutants turn into ground level ozone, which is a pollutant that is very bad for our lungs. The reactions, the chemical reactions that turn our tailpipe emissions into ground level ozone, they happen faster in warmer air. So the warmer it gets, the worse our air pollution gets. And ironically, the higher our carbon dioxide levels get in the atmosphere, the faster plants grow. And the plants that grow the fastest with more CO2 are weeds. So allergies are also getting worse as CO2 levels go up. What else is happening? Well, it's not just global warming, it's global weirding. And in fact, I have a PBS YouTube series that I do with our local KTTZ station. And the name of that series is Global Weirding. We have over 35 short videos explaining how we know climate is changing, how we know humans are responsible, and what are the impacts on Texas and other places. So if you want to put a link to that in the chat, the link is globalweirdingseries.com. You guys can bookmark that for later. We know that our hurricanes are getting bigger and stronger with a lot more rain. We know that heavy rainfall is getting more frequent because warmer air holds more water vapor. So when a storm comes along, there's more water vapor for it to sweep up and dump on us. We know that wildfire is burning much greater area because the soil and the plants are much drier. So when those gender reveal fireworks go off, there's a lot of dry tinder, so to speak, dry kindling to carry the fire. We also know that as heavy rainfall increases, it's increasing water contamination. And this is an issue here, but it's an even bigger issue, of course, in developing countries that don't have the filtration systems that we do. We know that a lot of diseases are carried by what scientists call vectors. And I don't mean arrows, I mean animals and insects that move. So mosquitoes are vectors, ticks, flies, they're all vectors that can carry disease. A lot of mosquitoes and ticks don't go very far north because they get killed off by cold winters. But as winters are warming, guess what's happening? A lot of those carriers or vectors are spreading northward. So now we have things like dengue fever and things like Lyme disease much further north than we ever have because winters are so much warmer. People are just starting to understand how climate change is affecting our mental health. It is making people anxious and afraid. There are people who are deciding not to have children because they don't know how they could bring a child into this uncertain world. And the increasing risk of disasters that are occurring, which around the world disproportionately affect the poor, they affect the marginalized, they affect the vulnerable, and they affect women and children. These disasters also carry an impact on our mental health as well as our physical health. I mentioned earlier how plants are growing faster as CO2 increases. You might think that's good news, but here's the thing. A plant that has vegetables on it, so, picture, say, a squash plant. It might grow faster as CO2 is higher, and so you might get a bigger squash, but that squash has the same amount of nutrients as a smaller squash. There's no change in the nutrients, it just grew bigger and faster because it has more CO2. So to get the same level of nutrients now, you have to eat more of the squash than you did before. And in poor countries, it's not likely that people are going to be able to get more food than they have currently. So it's actually affecting the nutritional quality of our food. And here's the bottom line. Resource scarcity is behind a lot of internal political conflict, a lot of political instability, and exacerbates, if not in some cases directly causes, refugee crises. So climate change is a public health crisis. And this last one is one of the biggest ones because increasingly we could see climate refugees becoming a problem that dwarfs any other refugee crisis that we've seen over the past century. The United Nations looks at the flows of people across boundaries, and as sea level rises, as hurricanes, typhoons, and cyclones get stronger, as droughts get more intense, as traditional rainfall patterns are disrupted. I just got a heartbreaking email this week from a woman in Kenya called Victoria. And she wrote to me and she said, "Dear Dr. Katharine, I know people who can no longer farm because our rainfall is not coming when it should come. And when it does come, it's too much and it floods everything and it destroys our crops. I have heard this is because of global warming. I need to understand why this is happening." It is already happening today and people are already being harmed. So what's the direct connection though between all of this and COVID? Well, it turns out that if our lungs have already been exposed to air pollution from burning fossil fuels for long periods of time, then it makes us more vulnerable. If we're exposed to coronavirus, we're more likely to get COVID. If we get COVID, we're more likely to get very sick from COVID. And what this is doing is continuing to exacerbate the inequalities within our society, where we have marginalized communities who are already disproportionately affected and exposed to air pollution. They are even more affected by COVID as a result. Everything just sort of fits together, and none of it's really good news. Because what we see happening, as I alluded to, is we see COVID and we see climate change affecting our economy directly. Not just the whole economy, but we see that it's not fair. It is disproportionately affecting people who already have the short end of the stick. That is happening in Houston. It's happening in Texas. It's happening across the US. It's happening in rich countries, and it's happening in poor countries. It's hard to estimate the economic impact of the pandemic. This is from The Economist just a few weeks ago. And they're estimating that the pandemic could amount to about possibly $10 trillion in lost gross domestic product over 2 years. They're estimating, the World Bank estimated that the world economy shrank by about 4.3%. How does this compare to climate change? Well, according to a study that came out this past year, the study is actually at the bottom there. If we don't fix climate change, we could be facing a price tag of $1 quadrillion. Yes, climate change has the potential to devastate the economy. And not only that, but it is already happening. It's not a future issue. A study published in 2019 by 2 Stanford researchers found that the economic gap between the richest and poorest countries in the world had already increased by as much as 25% since the 1960s. So the poorer countries are getting poorer. And a couple of countries like Canada here actually got a little bit richer as it got warmer, although that will turn around too. Now, how does this relate to COVID? We're seeing the same thing. COVID is already fueling more conflict, more poverty, more starvation. COVID pushes millions more children deeper into poverty. And these pictures are just really heartbreaking. We know that right here in the US, COVID is exposing inequalities that already exist. And a November report by the World Bank found that COVID is likely to push between 88 to 150 million more people into extreme poverty around the world. As you can see below, this number has been increasing significantly over time. This estimate was from November. Likely in another month or two, we might get an even higher number. But what happens when science meets policy? As soon as science meets policy, the science becomes politicized. I was recently reading a really interesting book called Scientists as Prophets by Linda Walsh. And what she pointed out is that this is not new. Philosopher David Hume was the first person to point this out several hundred years ago. He was a Scottish philosopher, and he pointed out that science can explain how the world is. So science can tell us that climate is changing, humans are responsible, and the impacts are serious. Science can even tell us that if we do this versus this, here's the likely outcome. Science can tell us that COVID is real, that COVID is spreading among humans, that COVID is serious, and that by avoiding contact, staying 6 feet away, wearing a mask, taking the vaccine, science can tell us that these things help to limit the spread of COVID. So science can explain the way the world is and the way that our choices will play out. Policy states what we ought or should to do about it. So you see the difference. One is explaining and the other is saying what should be done. There is a logical gap between those two that cannot be bridged without values. And values are intangible. Values can be informed by science, but two people could have the same set of science presented to them and could come to different conclusions regarding what ought to be done because people have different values. Our values are based on our culture. They're based on our personality. They're based on our life experiences. They're often based on our faith. They're based on the way we were brought up. And our values can differ significantly. And it doesn't mean that they're necessarily wrong or right. Two people can have different sets of values that are both very good values that could lead them to different conclusions. So what Linda points out is no matter how much data we have about climate change or COVID, values still stand between the science and effective policymaking. That's not all, though. So this explains why even a simple statement like humans are causing climate change or wearing a mask prevents the spread of COVID can become politicized, because even though they're just simple factual statements, they imply a response is needed. And the response implies an ought or a should, and that implies values, and values are where people disagree. So how does this relate to America? And again, don't forget, you can put questions in the Q&A at any moment. We just have a couple minutes left here, then we're going to be getting to all your questions for 20 minutes. So write your questions there, upvote the ones that you want us to answer. But how does this relate to the United States? Well, it turns out the US is exceptional around the world in terms of the nature of its political divide. In the US, making a simple statement that climate is changing is incredibly politicized to the point where last February, this figure here is from last February, so just before COVID hit, climate change was the #1 most politicized issue in the whole US. The width of the gray bar shows how far apart the average Republican and the average Democrat are on an issue, and these issues are ranked by the width of the gray bar. So then COVID happened. What happened to this ranking? Well, you know that COVID rapidly became very politically polarized. Even the simple existence of the virus, whether it was real or not, became politically polarized, let alone what to do about it. So you won't be surprised that by August, COVID had risen to become the #3 most politically polarized topic in the whole US. These now are not ranked by the width of the gray bar, so I'm going to point them out to you. #3 was COVID, most polarized. #2 was race and ethnic inequality. And what was #1? It was still climate change. Still. Not only that, but many of the same people and organizations who'd been spreading climate change myths for years and even decades were now spreading myths about climate or about COVID too. And so this cartoon really sort of tickled my funny bone. Doctors, physicians, medical experts, as long as we provide the facts to the American people, surely they'll understand. And we climate scientists are like, we've been doing that for 55 years. And in fact, pre-COVID, I had already given talks. In fact, I gave this talk with President Biden 2 years ago. I had already given talks about how facts are not enough. I have written essays. This one was in Science magazine about how facts are not enough. I have even made global weirding episodes about if I just explain the facts, surely they'll get it right. And the answer to that is no. Why? Because our values get in the way. So here's where I want to leave off as a jumping point to begin our discussion. When we look at effective policymaking in any science-related issue, and COVID and climate change are really the two at the very foremost of our minds and our concerns today, what do we need to do? What lessons have we learned? The first lesson we've learned is we have to begin not only with respect for the science, because you could say, I don't believe in gravity, but if you still step off the cliff, you're going down. Not only do we need to begin with a respect for facts and science, but we have to also begin with an awareness of our values, both those that will motivate people to act or to support action, as well as understanding the values that will motivate people to resist or to challenge action. We have been unforgivably naive often in our policymaking, just assuming that if we say it's a problem, people say, oh yes, what can I do? No, we need to understand the values that would help people understand why we need to act, but we also have to understand the values that would cause people to resist or challenge that action and try to get out ahead of that rather than just kind of playing catch up as we often have been. We should not naively assume that just overwhelming people with scientific information will ensure their support for constructive policies, because that science implies an ought or a should. And if that ought or should conflicts with somebody's values or their identity or their ideology, they will reject 200 years of solid, settled science as a result. Effective policymaking specifically identifies community values, things that people share across communities that can be leveraged to develop the needed support. So don't just say you should do it because I told you so, and don't just say you should do it because I think it's a good idea. Figure out why other people would think it's a good idea and explain that to them using their values, which may or may not be the same as yours. But lastly, obviously, effective policymaking has to be based on sound science. A temperature does not give you a thermometer does not give you a different answer depending on how you vote. But at the same time, we have to recognize that there is an irreducible tension between science that can tell what is or what will be depending on the choices we make versus what ought or should to be. And that's what policy decides. So where are we going? We're moving into a new world. We're seeing that cities around the world are reacting to COVID in ways that could help with climate change. We're seeing changes in transportation. We're seeing changes in assessing climate risk. This is in Canada. We're seeing around the world that 90% of new electricity installed during COVID was clean, renewable energy that doesn't produce air pollution either. We're seeing the world change. But to really create effective change, we have to understand the difference between science and policy, and we have to understand how to effectively put them together to help all of us connect the facts to the values that we already have. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Hayhoe, for your fantastic presentation. Now I'd like to open it up to a conversation with the audience. Members of the audience, if you have questions you'd like to ask, you can do so using the Q&A window. Some people have already done that during the talk, so thank you for that. As a reminder, please try and keep your questions short so they're easy to ask and answer and follow along with. And also remember, you can upvote questions that other people have asked so that those kind of go to the top of the queue. And we'll try to get to as many of your questions as possible. So I want to start by asking, as you said, climate change is one of the most divisive issues in American politics today. Well, now we're at the end of January, we have a new president sworn in, new Congress, and now Democrats are in control of the White House and both branches of Congress. What type of climate legislation do you anticipate or hope will pass? And do you think that given the values consideration, it's possible to pass it in a bipartisan manner?
Well, as a scientist, I would say that I would be in favor of any policy that cuts our carbon emissions, helps us prepare for the impacts or the risks of a changing climate, and rather than increasing the fault lines that run through our society that divide people and that marginalize people, that actually helps bring people together, and that especially cares for the least among us, the people who are already suffering, already living in poverty, already kind of pushed to the side. So that said, I'm not a policy expert, but I try to listen to people who are. And what I know is that if you listen to almost any economist in the world, including the two who won the Nobel Prize 2 years ago, if you listen to conservative leaders from both sides of the aisle and large corporations, what we hear is that there is significant bipartisan support for the concept of carbon pricing. Carbon pricing is not new. It was introduced by economists over 100 years ago, originally as an idea to understand that when we make choices, there can be consequences to our environment that then come right back and bite us in the rear, so to speak. And we should be putting a price on what comes back to bite us in the rear. So the idea is pretty simple, that polluters pay, and then you use the revenues from carbon pricing. You want to make sure it's revenue neutral to give people money back in their taxes, especially people in lower income brackets, so that they are not economically harmed by putting a price on carbon. You can also use some of the revenues for efficiency improvements. In the US alone, we could cut our carbon emissions 50% through efficiency alone. You can also use it to stimulate and provide incentives for new clean energy, et cetera. So where is carbon pricing currently implemented? Well, it is already implemented across the whole country of Canada. And in fact, the 4 provinces of Canada that had carbon pricing before it became a federal policy led the country in economic output. So it's not an economy killer. Also, a carbon price doesn't say you can't do something. If you want to drive an inefficient large Hummer, for example, now they're actually making electric Hummers now, but if you have an old Hummer and you want to drive it, you can. Nobody's telling you you can't, but you just have to pay the real price for it. Who supports carbon pricing in the United States? A bipartisan climate solutions caucus in both Congress and the Senate, where senators and Congress people are only allowed to join if they join with a partner from the other party. And there's also something called the Climate Leadership Council, which I will drop a link into the chat here in a few seconds, and I would encourage people to click on it. The Climate Leadership Council includes many Bush-era Republicans, George Shultz, Jim Baker. It includes large corporations like AT&T, Ford, and ExxonMobil, and they support putting a price on carbon because it is a free market solution. There's also organizations like Republic N. I'll put another link to that in the chat, led by a former Republican congressman from South Carolina, Bob Inglis, that support this. And so it has significant bipartisan support. And just as a practical human, I like to see bipartisan support because then I feel like there's less arguing and fighting over it. Who doesn't want to just get stuff done and just get the wheels out of the mud and actually start moving into the future? I think if you just asked Americans across the country that simple question, we get a big majority saying yes.
Yeah, that was an awesome answer, and I totally feel that, and I actually want to follow up with that because during your talk you showed some of the key issues that many Americans disagree on, but you're saying there's also a lot that people really do agree on. And so I was looking over some of the Yale climate opinion maps that you showed today, and some of the questions that they also asked were about policy changes, and there's a lot that there's huge support for across both both sides of the aisle. 70–80% of Americans want, research into renewable energy resources, and they believe that schools should teach global warming and stuff. So how can we channel this overwhelming public bipartisan support for measures like these into real policy change? And what are some things that, individuals can do about that to help push that forward?
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. It turns out that what the average person agrees on is far more than what politicians agree on. So you got politicians over here and over here on both sides. Let's be realistic. We always like to think of, well, the side we agree with is totally rational and reasonable, but it's the other side. No, we're both sides. Politicians on both sides are over here. And the vast majority of people are just here in the middle saying, look, doesn't it make sense to invest in clean energy when it grows more local jobs? It cleans up our air and our water. And aren't you a little bit worried that China is beating the pants off the US in the new energy economy? I mean, that's the way of the future. And it's like we're investing in horses and buggies, so to speak, when China's already turning out Model T Fords. Shouldn't we be catching up with them? And the good news, of course, here is in Texas, we actually do lead the US in wind energy. We're currently number 4 in solar energy, and we're planning to double our solar capacity this year, according to industry reports. But even still, the US is not number 1. China is way out ahead of the US. And a lot of people just agree, hey, this stuff just makes sense. Don't we want to keep the lights on? Don't we want to keep on growing new jobs? Of course, we still need oil and gas today. We can't just flip some magic switch and turn everything off today. But a sensible, sound transition really makes sense. And to do that, I think it makes sense to have conversations. And so that's why my TED Talk, which you referred to earlier, and I'll put a link in the chat right here. My TED Talk is called "The Most Important Thing You Can Do About Climate Change." Here's the link right here, is talk about it. Because if you go to those Yale maps, it turns out the darkest blue map they have is, do you ever talk about it? Nobody talks about it. And if we don't talk about it, why would we care? And if we don't care, why would we ever want to fix it? So that's why conversations are so important. And that's why, for example, I helped to start an organization called Science Moms that's specifically aimed at parents. If you're a dad too, you can join. I'll put the link in the chat there, to help people learn how to have conversations about why this matters, what we can do to fix it, and to talk to our elected officials at every level, not just federal, but at every level, our city, our county, the school, the place where we work, or even our place of worship. Talk to everybody we know about how there's sensible things that every single one of us can do in the place where we are to really make a difference and move us all forward together.
Thanks, and thanks for sharing all those links. So on a follow-up to that about having conversations, one of the questions from the chat is, what are your recommendations for reaching out to people who work in the fossil fuel industry and are afraid of losing their livelihoods? How can we have those conversations?
Well, many people in the fossil fuel industry are already very aware of this issue. And often, I don't know if you ever feel like this, but sometimes you feel like, there's something wrong and you should be going to the doctor, but you don't want to go to the doctor. So you don't want to think about it. So you just kind of push it off to the back of your brain and try to ignore it as long as you can. And then sometimes, by the time you actually go there, you're like, oh, you should have come in a lot earlier because we could have fixed this more easily. So I feel like rather than trying to shove our very, very real fears into the closet and shut the door on them, we really need to bring them out to the light. And we need to say this: we need energy. We can't live without energy. In fact, more people in developing countries still need energy. We've been using fossil fuels for a very long time, hundreds of years, and they have brought us untold benefits. And I don't know about you, but I am very grateful for the benefits fossil fuels have brought us. And I think that people working in the energy industry have really helped many, many, many people increase their quality of life, increase their standard of living, and have provided the energy that's needed to support industry all across the country and really around the world. So they've done a great job. And moving forward in the future, we still need that energy. Like I said, we even need it more than ever. But we are at a key transition point where we are transitioning. It's not going to happen overnight, but it's already happening. It's not a future, it's already happening today. So the question is, how can energy companies think ahead, not just to the quarterly returns or the annual returns? How can they think 10 years ahead? How can they think 20 years ahead? Because they have a lot of know-how, they have a lot of expertise, they understand the concepts of energy, they understand a lot of other valuable concepts that can be used, like drilling in other areas. How can those corporations look ahead to figure out how they could continue to be viable to support jobs in the future? Who could help them do that? Who can work together with them? And in what way can the concept of a just transition be used by the government to specifically work with communities where the entire economy is built on, say, coal mining, and there's really nothing else to do in that community, before you shut down the coal mine, not after, but before. And most, with coal mines, most of them are not shutting down. They're not shutting down because the government told them they have to. They're shutting down because they're just not economically viable anymore. So before the disaster happens, how about seeing if there's some industry or some factories or some productivity that could be specifically moved into that area, that the government could give them incentives to actually build a factory there, to provide training programs for anybody who wanted to transition to that new industry, to provide jobs that they can use to feed their family. And there's great organizations, like in Canada, there's one called Iron and Earth. I'll put a link in the chat there so you can check it out. That's all about retraining oil and gas people to do renewable energy installations, because a lot of it is the same technical skills and in the same places too. So this is a really important conversation that I feel like we're not having enough. And it really truly has to begin with gratitude for all the benefits fossil fuels have brought us. And then it has to continue with an acknowledgement we still need energy, but that energy is going to look very different in 20 years than it is today. And now's the time to make sure that we have that transition figured out.
Yeah, I really like how you described how we can both help the earth, but also help in communities, especially communities that have been invested in fossil fuel industries for a while. So we have another question from the chat that says, do you think it's more important to convince individuals that climate change is an issue, or go directly to the companies that are polluters? How can we make the most effective changes?
I would say yes, because I think it's really important to convince people at every level. So using our voice to advocate for understanding the risks and the solutions is really important. We can do that within our communities, within the place we work, within the schools that we attend or our kids attend, within the places that we worship, within our city or our county. We can also do it with major corporations, and some people actually specifically become stakeholders of corporations to attend the meetings and lobby for disclosure of climate risks. That's made a huge difference. I mean, big investment companies like BlackRock that control like $7 trillion worth of investments, they've made a decision not to invest in coal anymore because it's not economically viable. Norway's sovereign wealth fund, which I think controls about $1 trillion of resources, they've decided not to do any new oil and gas exploration. Citibank has also made similar decisions, thanks to people both within and without the corporation. Microsoft, Google, Amazon, all of these big organizations are taking significant action. Why are they doing so? They're doing so because of individual people. It might be because somebody's speaking out to them directly as an employee or as a shareholder, but it might be because of somebody who talked to somebody who then talked to somebody who talked to them. So that's why my answer really is yes, having these conversations is essential. And my TED Talk, which I put in the chat, kind of outlines how do you do that in a way that makes sense, isn't really scary, and usually, not always, but usually works.
And I can't recommend that TED Talk enough. Everyone in the audience, you should definitely go watch it. We have another question about science communication. And so the gist of the question is, in the US, COVID risks were kind of communicated, really muddily. It was hard because different sides of the aisle were saying different things. So when science is communicated very clearly and effectively on all different levels, are people better at assessing risks and adhering to, different kind of guidelines and actions? Kind of that values or that is versus ought discussion you were having earlier.
Yeah, I think that some of us are better at assessing risks than others, but a lot of our risk assessment is based on what we hear. So if we hear a lot of information about how something poses a risk, we're more likely to think that it does. And that brings me right back to what I was saying at the beginning. Only 1/3 of people in the entire United States ever hear anybody talk about climate change more than occasionally. Only 1/3. So if we don't ever talk about it, why would we ever understand the risks?
Yeah, that's a really good point.
Yeah.
We need to be able to have these conversations.
I've been typing super short answers in the Q&A. So if you did have a Q&A question, check the answers, because if I had a super short answer, I might have typed it for you.
Thanks for being able to multitask so effectively. So we are running up, it's 1:58, so in the last couple minutes. So I'd say, kind of the last question, if there's one big kind of action that people can take coming away from this talk, what would you recommend that people do? And I realize it's likely going to be a conglomerate of different things that you've already talked about, but what's one big thing people can take away into the future as we move into a new year, putting away the chaos of 2020 and trying to move forward?
I think that having these conversations is so important. Not fighting or arguing with people, but starting with shared values, like I talk about in my TED Talk, connecting the dots to why we are already the perfect person to care. We just hadn't realized it. And then sharing some of the incredibly positive solutions we have right here in Texas. In Texas, like I said, 20% of our electricity last year came from wind. Our solar production is doubling. We have over 30 to 35,000 jobs in Texas in wind and solar energy alone. We have the biggest army base in the US, Fort Hood, that's already been powered by clean energy for the last 3 years. The city of Houston, the mayor, has a climate action plan to not only prepare for the impacts of climate change, but to meet the Paris targets. And he has put helping people who are already marginalized and disadvantaged at the forefront of that plan. We know that Texas has the first carbon neutral airport in North America. I'm sorry, it is not in Houston, it's in Dallas, but Houston could keep up, I think. We know that the city of Dallas, its operations are already carbon neutral. Isn't that amazing? Nobody knows that. We know that there's really incredible things happening all across Texas, and we can and we should be boasting about them to people so that people understand that change is happening, it is already occurring, and we can each be part of that together.
Thank you so much for your great answer. And this has been a fantastic event. Thank you so much for coming here, Dr. Hayhoe, joining us to share your insights and experience in climate science and communication. Unfortunately, we're out of time this afternoon, so I'd like to thank the audience for your attention and invite you to attend other virtual events being hosted by Rice University and the Baker Institute for Public Policy. You can see more information about that on the Baker Institute's website. Thank you, Dr. Hayhoe, for coming and sharing your wisdom with us and experience. Thank you to all the people at the Baker Institute and Rice Science Policy Network for helping make this happen. I hope everyone is staying safe and healthy. Thanks so much for joining this afternoon, and take care.